We have spoken already on the History Fix about the Dutch Revolution, and last time we looked at the English Reformation and the way in which English society was being transformed, really, during the 16th and the early part of the 17th century. And I had suggested that there was a growing conflict between the strong monarchy, which had been created by the Tudors and had then been inherited by the new Stuart dynasty in 1603, a conflict between the monarchy and Parliament, which is it's a medieval institution, but it becomes the representative in this period of the propertied classes as a whole. The House of Lords representing the titled aristocracy, the House of Commons representing the gentry and the merchants and the important people living in the towns. And what was causing the tension really was the way in which elements of the old feudal establishment had sort of inserted themselves by becoming courtiers and using court favour as a way of advancing their interests. And bolstering an aspiration by the Stuart monarchs to establish a more authoritarian, a more absolutist form of government. Whereas what the new middle strata were eager to do was to see increasingly government control in the hands of Parliament. So they had effective control over taxation and government policy and so on. Now, this culminated in the attempt by Charles I, the second of the Stuart kings, to rule without Parliament. And he did this for 11 years. This period of time, starting in 1629 and continuing until 1640, sometimes dubbed by historians the 11 years personal rule or the 11 years tyranny. And it was a period when the conflict no longer acted out in Parliament, of course. The conflict is primarily acted out in the country as a conflict, again over religion, between the religion of the court, High Church Anglicanism, which to many people didn't seem to be very different from Catholicism, and a more mainstream form of Protestantism, generally speaking called Presbyterianism, which was the dominant religion among the people who would otherwise be sitting in Parliament if Parliament was actually meeting. And under the personal rule of the king, under the 11 years tyranny, there's an attempt by Charles I, supporting his Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Laud, there's an attempt to shift religion, the mainstream religion, the state religion, to more Catholic forms of worship. This is bitterly resented, not just in England, but also in Scotland, which has also experienced its own Reformation. And although Scotland and England at this time are still separate kingdoms, the king, Charles I, is also the King of Scotland, and Archbishop Laud is pushing for the same religious changes in Scotland as in England, and it's resented by the Protestant Scottish lords. The English, or as we should really call them, the British Revolutions, kick off in 1637 in Edinburgh, when a woman called Jenny Geddes hurls her stool at the Dean of St Giles when he conducts a service in a way that she, a strong Protestant, a firm Protestant, considers to be similar to the Catholic Mass. Very quickly indeed, there is a mass movement in Scotland. Everybody signs a document. It becomes known as the Covenant. the Solemn League and Covenant. So the Protestant supporters of the covenant become the Covenanters. They band together and insist that they are going to reject this attempt to impose a Catholic form, as it's seen, a Catholic form of religion. And the Scots not only organise themselves, but they build an army. When the king threatens to use military force to suppress what has turned into, effectively, a national revolt in Scotland against the rule of the Stuart kings. The two bishops' wars, as they are called, they're called bishops' wars because it's really an attempt to impose a hierarchy of bishops on the Scottish Church. These two bishops' wars result in defeats for the king, for King Charles I, and as a condition of making peace and not turning the war into an invasion of England, the Scots Covenanters insist that the king should pay them a large indemnity, otherwise they'll take their army south, putting the king in the position where he has to call Parliament for the first time in 11 years because he's got no money, because he's run out of money. There's a secret relationship, there's a conspiracy between the Scottish Covenanters and the English Presbyterians, and the purpose is to force King Charles I to recall Parliament, because it's only Parliament that has the power to grant taxation. Parliament reassembles. There's a brief, short Parliament where the king can't get what he wants. He dissolves Parliament again, tries to resume the war, and then forced to call Parliament again. And this is the Parliament that we know, that history knows, as the Long Parliament, meeting for the first time in 1640, and this becomes the bourgeois assembly of the British revolutions that now play out from 1640 for the next decade and a bit. The Long Parliament continues into the next decade, and it's the assembly that organises the revolutionary movement. Between 1640 and 1642, a conflict now plays out primarily in London, the whole focus of events shifting to London, with Parliament, the Long Parliament, refusing to grant taxation, refusing to allow the king to levy taxes, to build an army, until Parliament's grievances have been redressed. And they are many. Grievances about the use of royal courts, grievances about the attempt to impose arbitrary kinds of royal taxation, in particular disagreements about what is going on inside the English Church, the attempt to impose a more Catholic style of ritual and so on. These and other grievances, and in particular opposition to particular ministers, Archbishop Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's attempted to impose High Church Anglicanism, and Thomas Strafford, who has he's seen as the military strongman of the regime, and feeling against him is so embittered that the Long Parliament forces the king to allow them to put him on trial, and he's duly tried and condemned to death and executed. This is visceral stuff playing out at the top of the English state. And Charles I can't get his way, and Parliament is becoming increasingly assertive. But, and this is where I want to sort of say something about the strange character of this bourgeois revolution, and in a sense all bourgeois revolutions, because the people who make the British Revolution, like the people who will later make the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and so on, they are a property-owning class of people, or a group of property-owning classes who are joined together to make the revolution. And as property owners, they have something to gain by restructuring government, restructuring the state so that they have a bigger say, but they also potentially have something to lose. They have something to lose to those who are lower down in the social structure, who have less property or perhaps no property at all. And the fear in a bourgeois revolution among those who are driving the revolutionary process is always that they might lose control to more popular, more radical forces that want to push forward to a more far-reaching social revolution. So the bourgeois revolution is almost invariably characterized by a series of conflicts where the people who at one moment are pushing the revolution forwards, at the next moment are wanting to hold it back because they're worried about the empowerment of all radical social forces on their left. We can see that playing out very clearly in the English Revolution for the first time in December 1641, when large numbers of people, mainly Londoners, come onto the streets. They surround Parliament. Their slogan is "No bishops, no bishops," and their intention is to stop the bishops who sit in the House of Lords from taking their seats because they are seen as a reactionary bloc. In other words, they're trying to purge Parliament of its most reactionary elements, and by doing that, to give courage to those forces inside Parliament that aren't quite sure how far they want to push things forward. In other words, there's a push from the streets, there's a push from the crowds, the revolutionary crowds coming out onto the streets. This is December 1641. What is the response of the king? It is to attempt a military coup. Things have now got completely out of hand. There are revolutionary crowds on the streets. The bishops can't even take their seats in Parliament. Parliament is increasingly radical. Its demands are increasingly, as far as the king is concerned and the court is concerned, unreasonable. And at the beginning of January 1642, the king attempts to mount a military coup. He goes in with a body of soldiers to Parliament itself with the intention of arresting 5 leading opposition members. They have been forewarned. They have taken refuge in the City of London, which is solidly pro-Parliament. The City of London, which is a walled enclosure, closes the gates, pulls up the drawbridges, prepares for a defence. The king has effectively lost control of his capital, and he flees from the capital and sets up a new capital, a royalist capital, at Oxford, and the Civil War has begun. That Civil War, which the first serious fighting is in the autumn of 1642, lasts through until 1645 into 1646, when the king is defeated and captured. That civil war between parliamentarian forces based in London and the southeast and drawing their support mainly from the middling sort, and the royalist forces based largely in the north and the west and drawing the bulk of their support from the more backward feudal elements of the old elite. That civil war sees the playing out not just of a conflict between king and parliament, but another of those conflicts that take place within the revolutionary movement itself between more conservative and more radical revolutionaries. And this is where Oliver Cromwell comes into the story. I think probably the most important figure in the whole of British history, because Oliver Cromwell, he was a member of Parliament, but he's much more important for the story, not as a member of Parliament, but as a soldier in the Civil War. He raises his own regiment. He eventually comes to command the parliamentarian cavalry as a whole. He plays a central role in the building of what is called the New Model Army, which is essentially a field army which can move anywhere in the country in order to take the war to the king, in order to take the war to the royalist armies wherever they are deployed, a new kind of more mobile army. But crucially about Cromwell's contribution is that he is at loggerheads with conservative Presbyterian parliamentarians who are looking for compromise, who are looking for a negotiated peace with the king, who are trying to find a way out of the war. Whereas Cromwell, not a Presbyterian, a more radical kind of Protestant. The term that is used in England at the time is the independents. Cromwell is an independent, and many of the other army officers are also independents. And what people like Cromwell are doing is they're saying that we should base our movement on those who are most committed to the revolutionary cause. And who are they? They are the middling sort, not the big property owners represented in Parliament, but the middling sort, the ordinary, particularly the rich peasant yeoman farmers. I'm going to read one of the things that Cromwell says about this sense that you have to build an army of revolution out of that social group that is most committed to the revolutionary cause if you're going to have a chance of winning. This is how he puts it. He wants to recruit what he calls men of spirit, because he believes that he who prays best will fight best. A few honest men are better than numbers, he says. If you choose godly, honest men to be captains of horse, honest men will follow them. I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing more. Now, that in the context of England in the 1640s is the language of class war. In effect, what Cromwell is saying is that this is a class war between the middling sort, that we are organising into a revolutionary army, and the propertied elite at the top of society. That's redefining what this revolutionary movement is about. And next time on the History Fix, we'll be exploring further the implications of that when we look at the three-cornered struggle to define the new England which breaks out after the defeat of the king in the Civil War. Next time on the History Fix. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.